The October moon hung like a silver dollar over Dry Creek, Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. It was 1886, and the small mining town nestled between Red Rock canyons had seen better days. The silver veins were running thin, and with them, the hope that had once drawn fortune-seekers from across the nation. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Jake Loner McCready guided his horse, Thunder, along the winding path that followed the Snake River's edge. At 44, Jake had the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His steel-gray eyes, set deep in a face carved by wind and sun, missed nothing as they swept the moonlit landscape. He'd been riding the territory for 3 days, delivering a message to the mine foreman when the sound reached his ears. Splashing, desperate, frantic splashing that didn't belong to the river's natural rhythm. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and the horse snorted nervously. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, then relaxed as he heard something that chilled him more than any gunfight ever could, a child's terrified cry echoing across the water. "Help! Please! Somebody help me!" Without hesitation, Jake spurred Thunder toward the riverbank. Through the cottonwoods, he could see a small figure struggling in the dark water, arms flailing as the current threatened to drag him downstream toward the rocky rapids. Jake dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the muddy shore as he stripped off his gun belt and coat. The river was running high from recent rains, cold and treacherous in the darkness. "Hold on, boy!" Jake called out, wading into the icy water. "I'm coming." The child, no more than 10 years old, was caught in a tangle of fallen branches about 20 feet from shore. His small hands clawed desperately at the slippery wood, his face pale as death above the churning water. Jake fought against the current, his powerful arms cutting through the river as he reached the struggling boy. Up close, he could see the terror in the child's wide brown eyes, terror that seemed to go deeper than just fear of drowning. "I've got you," Jake said firmly, wrapping one strong arm around the boy's thin chest. "Stop fighting and let me get you to shore." But as Jake began swimming back, the boy suddenly grabbed his shirt with surprising strength. "Don't take me back to town," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the water. "Please, mister. They'll find me there." "Who'll find you?" Jake asked, but the boy just shook his head, his lips trembling from more than just cold. Jake pulled them both onto the muddy bank, the boy collapsing against him like a broken bird. In the moonlight, Jake could see the child was well-dressed, too well-dressed for a miner's son. His clothes, though soaked and torn, were made of fine wool and cotton. This was no street orphan. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked gently, wrapping the boy in his coat. The child looked up at him with those haunted eyes. "Tommy," he whispered. "Tommy Whitmore." Jake's blood ran cold. The Whitmore name carried weight in Dry Creek. Old money, old power, and old secrets. Samuel Whitmore owned half the businesses in town and had his fingers in the other half. "Tommy Whitmore?" Jake repeated. "Son, your family's probably worried sick about you. What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" Tommy's face crumpled, and tears mixed with river water on his cheeks. "I can't go home," he sobbed. "I can't ever go home again." "Why not?" The boy's voice dropped to a whisper that made Jake's skin crawl. "Because they pushed me in. They wanted me to drown." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Who pushed you, Tommy?" But the boy just shook his head violently, pressing his face against Jake's chest. "I can't tell. They said if I ever told anyone, they'd finish what they started. They said the river would be my grave." Jake looked down at the trembling child in his arms, then back at the dark water that had nearly claimed him. On Tommy's left wrist, barely visible in the moonlight, was a strange mark, like a burn, but too precise to be accidental. It looked almost like a brand, though Jake had never seen its like before. "Listen to me, Tommy," Jake said, his voice steady and calm. "Nobody's going to hurt you while you're with me. You understand? But I need to know what happened." Tommy pulled back slightly, studying Jake's face in the moonlight. "You're not from here, are you? You don't know them." "No, I'm not from here. Name's Jake McCready. And you're right. I don't know anybody in this town well enough to be scared of them." For the first time, something like hope flickered in Tommy's eyes. "Will you help me? Even if it means going against important people?" Jake thought of all the towns he'd drifted through, all the injustices he'd witnessed and walked away from. But something about this boy, this terrified child who'd been thrown into a river to die, stirred something in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. "I'll help you," he said simply. Tommy nodded, then glanced nervously at the lights of Dry Creek twinkling in the distance. "We can't go to the sheriff. He's one of them. And we can't go to the hotel. They'll be watching." "Then where?" Tommy pointed toward a cluster of buildings on the outskirts of town. "There's an old woman named Martha Hendricks. She runs a boarding house for minors. She's good people and she doesn't ask questions." Jake helped Tommy to his feet, noting how the boy favored his left leg. "Can you ride?" "I think so." Jake whistled softly, and Thunder trotted over. As he lifted Tommy onto the horse, the boy grabbed his arm again. "Mr. McCready," Tommy whispered, "there's something else you should know. I'm not the first." "What do you mean?" "There was another boy 2 years ago, Billy Carson. They said he fell in the river and drowned." Tommy's voice was barely audible. "But I saw them that night too. I saw them push him in, just like they pushed me." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I was only 8. Nobody would have believed me. And Billy's family, they left town right after the funeral. Said they couldn't bear the memories." As Jake mounted Thunder behind Tommy, his mind was already working. 2 boys, 2 accidents, and a town full of secrets. Whatever was happening in Dry Creek, it was bigger than just one frightened child. "Hold tight," he told Tommy as they rode toward the distant lights of Martha Hendricks' boarding house. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." But even as he spoke the words, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from the shadows along the riverbank. Martha Hendricks' boarding house sat like a weathered sentinel on the edge of Dry Creek, its windows glowing warmly against the pre-dawn darkness. The 60-year-old widow had seen enough trouble in her lifetime to recognize it when it came knocking at her door at 4 in the morning, dripping wet and carrying a terrified child. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, ushering Jake and Tommy inside without question. Her gray hair was hastily pinned up, and her worn cotton nightgown was covered by a thick wool robe. "Get that boy by the fire before he catches his death." Jake carried Tommy to the stone fireplace, where embers still glowed from the evening's fire. Martha bustled around them, stoking the flames and fetching dry blankets and hot coffee. "Mrs. Hendricks," Jake began, but she held up a weathered hand. "Martha, son, and I don't need explanations right now. I can see well enough what's happened." Her sharp blue eyes took in Tommy's fine clothes, his terrified expression, and the way he flinched every time a board creaked in the old house. "The boy's been through hell." Tommy looked up at her gratefully. "You'll remember me, don't you, Mrs. Hendricks? I used to come here with my mother when I was little. She'd bring food to the miners when they were sick." Martha's expression softened. "Course I remember you, Tommy Whitmore. Sweet little thing always hiding behind your mama's skirts." Her face darkened. "God rest her soul. Losing her like that nearly killed your father." Jake noticed Tommy's reaction to the mention of his father. The boy's whole body tensed and his hands clenched into fists. "Tommy," Jake said gently, "tell Martha what you told me about tonight." But before Tommy could speak, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night. Multiple riders moving fast toward the boarding house. "Upstairs," Martha commanded, her voice suddenly sharp with authority. "Both of you, second door on the right. Don't make a sound." Jake grabbed Tommy and headed for the narrow staircase, but not before he saw Martha pull an old shotgun from behind the kitchen door. Whatever was coming, she was ready for it. From the upstairs window, Jake watched as 5 riders approached the boarding house. Even in the darkness, he could make out the lead rider, a tall man in an expensive coat, sitting his horse like he owned the world. Behind him rode 4 others, including a man wearing a sheriff's badge that glinted in the moonlight. "That's him," Tommy whispered, pressing against Jake's side. "That's my father." Samuel Whitmore. Jake studied the man below. Samuel Whitmore looked every inch the successful businessman, well-dressed, confident, commanding. But there was something in the way he sat his horse, something predatory in his posture, that set Jake's teeth on edge. "And the sheriff?" Jake asked. "Deputy Marshal Crenshaw," Tommy said bitterly. "He does whatever my father tells him to do." The men dismounted, and Samuel Whitmore strode to Martha's door. His knock was loud and imperious, the knock of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "Mrs. Hendricks!" his voice boomed. "Open this door immediately!" Martha's voice drifted up from below, calm and steady. "Mr. Whitmore, it's past 4 in the morning. What's the meaning of this?" "My son is missing. He fell into the river tonight, and we have reason to believe someone may have pulled him out and brought him here." Jake felt Tommy tremble beside him. The boy's father was lying smoothly, already crafting a story that would explain away any witnesses to what had really happened. "I haven't seen your boy," Martha replied firmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your voice down. I have paying guests trying to sleep." "We need to search the premises," Deputy Marshal Crenshaw interjected. "This is official business." "You got a warrant?" Martha's voice carried a steel edge that surprised Jake. There was a moment of silence, then Samuel's voice again, smoother now, more persuasive. "Martha, we're not enemies here. My boy could be dying somewhere. Surely you understand a father's concern?" "I understand a lot of things, Samuel Whitmore," Martha replied, "including the difference between a father's concern and a man covering his tracks." Jake saw Samuel's posture stiffen. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Your boy's been scared of something for months now. Anyone with eyes could see it. And now he's missing, and you're out here with armed men instead of organizing a proper search party." Tommy gripped Jake's arm. "She knows," he whispered. "Mrs. Hendricks knows something's wrong." Below, the conversation continued, but Jake could sense the tension escalating. Samuel Whitmore was a man used to getting his way, and Martha Hendricks was clearly not intimidated by his wealth or position. "I think we should look around anyway," one of the other riders said. Jake recognized the voice. It belonged to a man he'd seen earlier in the saloon, a hard-faced individual with the look of a hired gun. "You'll do no such thing," Martha snapped. "This is private property, and unless you have legal authority, you can get back on your horses and ride out." "Mrs. Hendricks," Samuel's voice had turned cold, threatening. "I hope you're not making a mistake that you'll regret. The only mistake I see here is a group of armed men threatening an old woman in the middle of the night," Martha replied. "Now get off my property before I decide to test whether this old shotgun still works." There was a long pause. Then Jake heard Samuel's voice, low and menacing. "This isn't over, Martha. If my boy is here, I'll find him, and if you're hiding him, there will be consequences." "There's always consequences, Samuel," Martha replied quietly. "The question is, who's going to face them?" The men mounted their horses and rode away, but Jake noticed that one of them, the hired gun, circled back and took up a position where he could watch the boarding house from a distance. "They're watching us," Jake told Tommy as they made their way back downstairs. Martha was waiting for them, the shotgun still in her hands. "That they are," she said grimly. "Samuel Whitmore's not a man who gives up easily." "Mrs. Hendricks," Tommy said, his voice small and frightened, "I need to tell you something. About my mother." Martha set down the shotgun and knelt beside the boy. "What is it, child?" "She didn't die in an accident," Tommy whispered. "I heard them talking. My father and Mr. Crenshaw. They said she'd found out about the mine contracts, about the money they were stealing. They said she was going to expose them." Jake felt his blood run cold. "Tommy, are you saying your father killed your mother?" Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And tonight, when I told him I knew the truth, he said I was going to have an accident too, just like Billy Carson, just like my mother." Martha's face had gone pale. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "Samuel's been killing people to protect his secrets." "There's more," Tommy continued. The mine contracts aren't the only thing. There's something else. Something bigger. I heard them talking about a shipment coming through next week. Something worth enough to kill for. Jake looked out the window at the lone rider watching the house. We need to get you somewhere safe, Tommy. Somewhere your father can't reach you. There is no such place, Tommy said hopelessly. He owns this town. Everyone's either working for him or too scared to stand against him. But Martha's eyes had taken on a determined gleam. Not everyone, she said firmly. There are still some good people in Dry Creek, people who remember what this town was like before Samuel Whitmore bought and paid for it. She moved to an old desk in the corner and pulled out a piece of paper. I'm writing a letter to Judge Morrison in Tucson. He's an honest man, and he has the authority to investigate what's happening here. That'll take days, Jake pointed out, and we don't know if the letter will even get through. Then we'll have to make sure Tommy stays alive until help arrives, Martha said grimly. And that means finding out exactly what Samuel Whitmore is so desperate to hide. Tommy looked up at Jake with those haunted eyes. Will you help me find the truth, even if it means going up against the most powerful man in the territory? Jake thought about all the times he'd walked away from trouble, all the injustices he'd ignored in favor of keeping his own skin intact. But looking at this brave, terrified boy, he knew those days were over. I'll help you, he said simply. Whatever it takes. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Dry Creek, painting the sky the color of blood. And somewhere in the growing light, Jake knew Samuel Whitmore was planning his next move. Dawn broke over Dry Creek like a crimson wound across the sky, and with it came the realization that Tommy Whitmore's nightmare was far from over. Jake had spent the remaining hours before sunrise studying the strange mark on the boy's wrist, and what he'd discovered made his blood run cold. It's a brand, he told Martha quietly, as Tommy slept fitfully on the couch by the fireplace. But not like any cattle brand I've ever seen. This is something else entirely. Martha examined the mark through her wire-rimmed spectacles. The symbol was roughly circular, with what looked like intertwining snakes or vines forming a pattern that seemed to shift and writhe in the morning light. I've seen this before, she whispered, her face pale. Years ago, when the first miners came through, there was talk of a secret society, men who controlled the mining claims and decided who got rich and who got buried. The Order of the Serpent, Tommy said softly from the couch, making them both jump. His young face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert. That's what they call themselves. I heard my father talking about it with the others. Jake knelt beside the boy. What else did you hear? Tommy sat up slowly, wincing as he moved his injured leg. They meet in the old mine shaft outside town, the one everyone says is played out, but it's not. There's still silver there, lots of it. They've been taking it out secretly and selling it through contacts in Mexico. That's why they killed your mother, Martha said, the pieces falling into place. She found out about the illegal mining operation. More than that, Tommy continued. She found out they were using the mine for something else, too. Something that made even my father nervous when he talked about it. Before Jake could ask what that might be, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. But this time, it wasn't Samuel Whitmore and his men. Through the window, Jake could see a lone rider approaching, a woman in a dark riding dress, her auburn hair catching the morning light. That's Miss Catherine Morrison, Tommy said, a note of hope entering his voice for the first time. She's the school teacher. She was friends with my mother. Martha opened the door as the woman dismounted. Catherine Morrison was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent green eyes and the kind of quiet strength that came from facing down a classroom full of unruly children every day. Martha, she said breathlessly, I came as soon as I heard. Is it true? Is Tommy really here? Come in, child, Martha said, glancing nervously at the hills where Samuel's men might be watching. Quickly now. Catherine rushed to Tommy's side, her face filled with relief and concern. Tommy, thank God you're safe. The whole town's talking about how you fell in the river. Your father's been organizing search parties all morning. Miss Morrison, Tommy said urgently, you have to listen to me. I didn't fall in the river. They pushed me in. My father and his men, they tried to kill me." Catherine's face went white. "Tommy, that's a very serious accusation. Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Tommy said firmly. "And I can prove it." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the branded mark on his wrist. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dear God," she whispered. "It's real. The stories my father told me. I thought they were just legends." Jake looked at her sharply. "Your father?" "Judge Morrison in Tucson," Catherine explained. "He's been investigating rumors of a secret organization operating in the mining territories for years. He said they marked their victims before they killed them, like some kind of twisted ritual." "The Order of the Serpent," Martha said grimly. Catherine nodded. "Father's been trying to gather evidence, but witnesses have a way of disappearing or changing their stories. He'll want to hear about this immediately." "We've already sent word to him," Martha said. "But it'll be days before he can get here, and I don't think we have that long." As if summoned by her words, the sound of many horses approaching echoed across the morning air. Through the window, Jake could see at least a dozen riders surrounding the boarding house. Samuel Whitmore sat at their head, his face a mask of cold determination. "Mrs. Hendricks!" His voice boomed across the yard. "I know my son is in there. Send him out now, and no one else needs to get hurt." Jake checked his Colt, making sure it was loaded. "How many ways out of this place?" he asked Martha. "Just the front door and the back," she replied. "But the back leads right into open ground. We'd be sitting ducks." Catherine moved to the window, her face set with determination. "Let me talk to him," she said. "As the school teacher, I have some standing in this community. Maybe I can reason with him." "Miss Morrison," Tommy said urgently, "you don't understand. My father isn't reasonable anymore. The order has changed him. They've changed all of them." But Catherine was already moving toward the door. "I have to try." She stepped out onto the porch, her hands visible and empty. "Mr. Whitmore," she called out. "I'm Catherine Morrison. I'd like to speak with you about Tommy." Samuel's cold eyes fixed on her. "Miss Morrison, I should have known you'd be involved in this. Your father's been a thorn in our side for too long." "Tommy needs medical attention," Catherine said firmly. "He's been through a terrible ordeal. Surely his well-being is more important than whatever disagreement you might have with my father." Samuel laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Medical attention? The boy needs discipline, not coddling. He's been filling people's heads with wild stories, and it has to stop." "What kind of stories?" Catherine asked, though Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. "The kind that could get people hurt," Samuel replied ominously. "The kind that make a father question whether his son can be trusted to keep the family's private business private." Inside the house, Tommy had gone rigid with fear. "He's going to kill her too," he whispered, "just like he killed my mother." Jake made a decision. He moved to the back door, checking the yard beyond. As Martha had said, it was open ground, but there was a line of cottonwoods about 50 yards away that might provide cover. "Martha," he said quietly, "when I give the signal, you and Tommy head for those trees. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run." "What about Miss Morrison?" Tommy asked. "I'll get her out," Jake promised, though he wasn't sure how. Outside, the conversation was taking a dangerous turn. "Miss Morrison," Samuel was saying, "I'm going to give you one chance to step aside. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Whitmore?" Catherine's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "I'm stating facts," Samuel replied. "This town has room for only one kind of people, those who understand the natural order of things. Your father never learned that lesson. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake." That's when Jake saw the glint of metal in one of the riders' hands. A rifle being slowly raised and aimed at Catherine's back. "Now!" Jake shouted, bursting through the front door with his Colt drawn. The morning exploded into chaos. Jake's first shot took the rifleman out of his saddle before he could fire. Catherine dove for cover behind a water trough as Samuel's men opened fire, their bullets splintering the wooden porch around Jake's head. "Get to the trees!" Jake yelled to Martha and Tommy as they ran from the back of the house. But as Jake ducked behind a support beam, returning fire at Samuel's men, he realized they were trapped. More riders were approaching from the direction of town. At least 20 men, all armed, all loyal to Samuel Whitmore. "Surrender now, McCready," Samuel called out. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Give me my son and I might let you live." Jake looked toward the trees where Martha and Tommy had taken cover. The boy was safe for now, but for how long? Samuel Whitmore had the resources of an entire town at his disposal, and Jake was just one man with a six-shooter and a stubborn streak. But as he prepared to make what might be his last stand, Jake heard something that changed everything. The sound of more horses approaching, but from a different direction. And leading them was a man wearing a federal marshal's badge, his face grim with purpose. Judge Morrison had arrived early, and he'd brought help. The real battle for Dry Creek was about to begin. The morning sun climbed higher over Dry Creek as two forces faced each other across Martha Hendricks's yard. Samuel Whitmore's private army of corrupt lawmen and hired guns on one side, and Federal Marshal James Morrison with 6 deputies on the other. Between them, Jake McCready crouched behind the water trough with Catherine, while Tommy and Martha remained hidden in the cottonwoods. "Samuel Whitmore!" Marshal Morrison's voice carried the authority of federal law. "You and your men are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and attempted murder. Lay down your weapons immediately!" Samuel's laugh was bitter and defiant. "You have no jurisdiction here, Morrison. This is a local matter, and I'm handling it according to local law." "Local law?" Morrison spurred his horse forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "You mean the law you bought and paid for? The law that let you murder your own wife and try to kill your son?" Jake saw Samuel's face contort with rage. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can," Morrison replied calmly. "We found Billy Carson, Samuel. He didn't drown 2 years ago like you claimed. He made it to the next town downstream, half dead but alive. He's been waiting for someone he could trust to tell his story to." The color drained from Samuel's face. "That's impossible. The boy drowned. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what you wanted them to know," Morrison corrected. "But Billy Carson is very much alive, and he's told us everything. About the Order of the Serpent, about the illegal mining operation, about how you've been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose you." Tommy emerged from the trees, his young face set with determination despite his fear. "It's over, Father," he called out. "I'm not going to be silent anymore. I'm going to tell everyone what you did to Mother, what you tried to do to me." Samuel's eyes fixed on his son with a mixture of fury and something that might have been pain. "You ungrateful little wretch. Everything I did was to protect our family's legacy, to ensure our future. You destroyed our family," Tommy shot back, tears streaming down his face. "You killed my mother. You tried to kill me. What kind of legacy is that?" For a moment, Samuel seemed to waver, and Jake thought he saw a flicker of the man he might have been before greed and power corrupted him. But then his face hardened again. "Deputy Crenshaw!" Samuel barked. "Arrest that boy for making false accusations against his father!" But Crenshaw hesitated, his eyes darting between Samuel and the federal marshals. "Mr. Whitmore, maybe we should—" "Do it!" Samuel roared. "Or you'll find yourself in the same river as the others!" The threat was too much for Crenshaw. The corrupt deputy's nerve finally broke, and he threw down his badge. "I'm done, Samuel. I won't be part of this anymore." One by one, Samuel's other men began to lower their weapons. Faced with federal marshals and the truth finally coming to light, their loyalty to Samuel Whitmore crumbled like sand. But Samuel himself wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Tommy. "If I can't have my son's silence, then I'll have his death." Jake moved without thinking, throwing himself between Samuel and the boy just as the gun fired. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to the ground. But his sacrifice gave Marshal Morrison the opening he needed. Morrison's shot was clean and precise, striking Samuel's gun hand and sending his weapon flying. Samuel clutched his wounded hand, his face twisted with pain and defeat. "It's over, Samuel," Morrison said quietly as his deputies moved in to make the arrest. "The Order of the Serpent ends here." So Catherine rushed to Jake's side, pressing her handkerchief against his wounded shoulder. "You saved him," she said softly. "You saved Tommy. Jake winced as he sat up, looking at the boy who stood trembling but alive in the morning sunlight. Kid deserved a chance to grow up without fear, he said simply. As Samuel was led away in shackles, he called out one last time to his son. "Tommy, you'll regret this. Without the family name, without the money, you'll have nothing." Tommy looked at his father with eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years. "I'll have something you never had, Father. I'll have a clear conscience." Martha emerged from the trees and gathered Tommy into her arms. "You'll have more than that, child. You'll have people who care about you, people who will help you build a better life." Marshal Morrison approached Jake as Catherine helped him to his feet. "Mr. McCready, I owe you a debt of gratitude. Without your intervention, we might never have gotten the evidence we needed to bring down the order." "What happens now?" Jake asked, nodding toward Tommy. "The boy will be placed with relatives in California," Morrison explained. "Good people who'll give him the love and stability he needs. As for the mining operation, all assets will be seized and the profits returned to the legitimate claim holders." "And the town?" Morrison looked around at the gathered townspeople, who had emerged from their homes as word of Samuel's arrest spread. "Dry Creek will have a chance to start over, to become the kind of community it was meant to be." 3 days later, Jake stood on the platform of the newly arrived train, his arm in a sling but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Tommy was beside him, a small traveling bag in his hand, and hope in his eyes for the first time since Jake had pulled him from the river. "You sure you won't come with me, Mr. McCready?" Tommy asked. "My aunt and uncle would welcome you. They said any friend of mine is family to them." Jake smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "I appreciate that, son, but I've got my own path to follow. Besides, you don't need an old drifter like me anymore. You've got the strength to face whatever comes next." Catherine approached them, carrying a small wrapped package. "This is for you, Tommy," she said. "Something to remember your mother by." Tommy unwrapped the package to reveal a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes, eyes that looked remarkably like Tommy's own. "She was proud of you," Catherine said softly. "She would have been proud of your courage these past few days." As the train whistle blew, Tommy hugged Jake tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving me, for believing me, for helping me find the truth." "You saved yourself, son," Jake replied. "I just gave you a little help along the way." Tommy boarded the train, and Jake watched through the window as the boy settled into his seat. As the train began to pull away, Tommy pressed his hand against the glass and mouthed, "Thank you one more time." Jake stood on the platform until the train disappeared around a bend in the canyon, carrying Tommy Whitmore toward a new life free from fear and secrets. Then he turned and walked back toward the main street of Dry Creek, where Thunder waited patiently at the hitching post. Martha and Catherine were there to see him off. "You sure you won't stay?" Martha asked. "The town could use a good man like you." Jake shook his head with a gentle smile. "This town's got good people already. It just took a little courage to let them shine through." He mounted Thunder and tipped his hat to the 2 women who had helped save a boy's life and expose a conspiracy that had poisoned an entire community. As he rode out of Dry Creek, Jake McCready carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, one person's willingness to stand up for what's right could change everything. The Loner Cowboy had found something in that small Arizona town that he'd been searching for without knowing it. The chance to make a difference, to be part of something bigger than himself. Behind him, Dry Creek began the long process of healing, its future bright with possibility. And somewhere on a train heading west, a brave young boy looked forward to tomorrow without fear for the first time in his life. The river that had nearly claimed Tommy Whitmore now flowed clean and clear, its dark secrets finally brought to light. And in the distance, Jake McCready rode toward whatever adventure awaited him next, knowing that he had helped write a story with the only ending that truly mattered. A happy one. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.